March 14, 2017. A husband gets the call no man should ever receive. A fatal crash. A body burned beyond recognition. A wife lost forever. For 6 years, Eduardo Helms lived in grief, raising their daughter alone, suffocating under a loss that never faded. But fate is cruel, because on a warm July evening in Freeport, Bahamas, Eduardo looked up and saw something that shattered his reality. His hands went cold. His heart pounded. His world tilted. There she was, smiling, alive, holding the hand of his best friend. Everything he knew was a lie. And now, it was time for the truth. Welcome to Crime Obsession. A huge thank you to my subscribers for your continued support as we grow. We are dedicated to bringing you the best told and untold crime stories every single day. If you're new here, please don't forget to subscribe. Let's begin. Eduardo Helms grew up in the heart of Atlanta, where the summers were thick with humidity and the streets hummed with the rhythm of people trying to make something of themselves. He learned early that discipline meant survival, that structure meant success. His father was a construction worker who came home every night with concrete dust in his lungs and pride in his eyes, teaching Eduardo that honest work built honest men. So Eduardo became an engineer, not the flashy kind, but the kind who designed bridges and calculated load-bearing walls, the kind who believed in foundations that would never crack. He met Yvonne Henderson on a September afternoon in 2009 at Georgia Tech during a career fair. Before she even spoke, he noticed the red blazer she wore, bold against a sea of conservative navy and gray. She stood out like a flame in the dark, and when she smiled at him, Eduardo felt something shift in his carefully constructed world. She was studying journalism with dreams of exposing corruption, of telling stories that mattered. She talked fast and laughed loud and wore red like it was her birthright, her signature, her war paint. They fell in love the way young people do, with reckless certainty, convinced they had found something the world couldn't touch. Eduardo, the steady one who planned every detail, and Yvonne, the wildfire who lived on instinct and passion. They balanced each other, or so he thought. They married in 2012 in a small ceremony in Piedmont Park, with white roses and her in a red sash because she refused to be a traditional bride. Eduardo didn't care because she was his, and that was enough. Marcus Cole entered their lives during those college years, a business major with a smile that could sell anything and a charm that made strangers feel like old friends. He and Eduardo bonded over late-night study sessions and pick-up basketball games, and when Eduardo introduced Marcus to Yvonne, the three of them became inseparable. The trio that everyone knew. Marcus was the best man at their wedding, the godfather to their daughter Karen, born in 2014, the friend who showed up with pizza when Eduardo worked overtime, the one who made Yvonne laugh until she cried. Eduardo trusted him the way you trust gravity, constant, unquestionable, absolute. And that trust would be the crack in his foundation, the fault line that would bring everything crashing down. March 14, 2017 started like any Tuesday, unremarkable, ordinary, the kind of day that doesn't warn you it will split your life into before and after. Eduardo was working late at the office, reviewing structural plans for a new bridge project, when his phone rang at 11:47 p.m. The number was local but unfamiliar, and when he answered, a woman's voice said, "Mr. Helms, this is Officer Patricia Moore with the Georgia State Patrol." And everything inside him went cold. There had been an accident on Highway 80 near Savannah, a single-vehicle collision on a rain-soaked stretch of road around 9:30 p.m. The car had gone off the road, hit a guardrail, and erupted into flames. By the time emergency services arrived, the fire had consumed everything. The officer's voice was professional, detached, the way people sound when they've delivered this news too many times. But Eduardo heard something else underneath it. Something like pity. They found a purse thrown clear from the vehicle before the fire spread. Inside was Yvonne's driver's license, her credit cards, a lipstick, the deep crimson shade she always wore. The vehicle was registered in her name, a 2015 Honda Accord Silver, the same car she drove every day. But the body. The officer paused, and Eduardo's hand tightened around the phone. The body was burned beyond recognition. Dental records would be needed for positive identification, but there were other identifying markers. A wedding ring, white gold with a small diamond, the band partially melted but still recognizable. And a necklace Eduardo had given her on their 5th anniversary, a delicate gold chain with a tiny compass pendant, because he told her she was his true north. The officer asked if he could come to Savannah to provide additional information for the identification process, and Eduardo said yes. But the word came out wrong, broken, like something inside his throat had shattered. He drove through the night, rain hammering his windshield, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. And all he could think was that he hadn't kissed her goodbye that morning, because Karen was crying and Yvonne was rushing out the door, late for a meeting in Savannah, and he'd been annoyed about the dishes she'd left in the sink. And now she was gone. Burned away to nothing but metal and ash. The funeral was held on a gray March morning at Wesley Chapel in Atlanta, and the closed casket sat at the front, draped in white lilies. Eduardo couldn't bear red anymore, couldn't stand the color that had been hers, that had made her brilliant and alive, and now meant nothing but absence. The casket was empty, or might as well have been, because what they buried wasn't her. Just fragments and ash sealed away in polished mahogany that would rot in the ground while Eduardo was supposed to keep living. 3-year-old Karen didn't understand why Mommy wasn't coming home. She kept asking when Yvonne would be back from her trip, kept leaving drawings by the door with stick figures labeled Mommy Daddy Me in crayon that Eduardo would find at night and have to turn face down. He couldn't look at them, couldn't explain death to a child who still believed in magic, who thought if she wished hard enough, Mommy would walk through the door in her red coat, smiling like always. Marcus was there at the funeral, his face drawn and pale. He held Eduardo when Eduardo's knees buckled during the eulogy. He carried Karen when she got tired. He stayed after everyone else left and helped pack away Yvonne's clothes, her makeup, her journals full of half-written stories that would never be told. And when Marcus cried, Eduardo thought it was grief, thought they were mourning together, brothers in loss. He didn't see the guilt, didn't recognize it for what it was. Eduardo's mother, Helen, arrived from Detroit 3 days after the funeral, a sturdy woman with silver hair and hands that never stopped moving. She took one look at her son and knew he was drowning. She moved into the spare bedroom without asking, started picking up Karen from daycare, started cooking meals that Eduardo didn't eat, started keeping the house running while Eduardo sat in his home office staring at blueprints that blurred into meaningless lines. He went through the motions, woke up, showered, dressed, went to work, came home, kissed Karen goodnight. But he was empty, a hollow version of himself going through rituals that no longer meant anything. His co-workers stopped asking how he was doing after he snapped at someone for suggesting he take more time off. His friends stopped calling after he ignored them for months. Marcus kept trying, kept showing up with takeout, kept offering to watch Karen, kept saying, "I'm here for you, brother, whatever you need." And Eduardo let him, because he had nothing left to give anyone. At night, Eduardo would stand in Karen's doorway watching her sleep and wonder how he was supposed to teach her to be strong when he was shattered. How he was supposed to tell her about her mother when he couldn't say Yvonne's name without his voice breaking. How he was supposed to be both parents when he could barely manage to be one. And the weight of it crushed him, day after day after day, until he forgot what it felt like to be whole. For the first 6 months, Marcus was there every week without fail. He'd show up on Friday nights with a 6-pack of beer, and they'd sit on Eduardo's back porch while Karen played inside with Helen. Marcus would talk about nothing important, about work, about sports, about anything except the woman they'd both lost. And Eduardo was grateful for it, grateful that someone understood that sometimes you needed to pretend the world was still normal, even when it wasn't. Marcus took him to Hawks games, tried to get him interested in life again, dragged him to bars where they'd nurse whiskeys in silence. Because what was there to say? Marcus had lost his best friend's wife, the woman who'd been like family. And Eduardo had lost everything. They sat with that weight between them, thick and unspoken, and Eduardo thought, this is what grief does. It isolates you even when you're not alone. But something shifted around month 7. Marcus started canceling plans, said he had work emergencies, business trips that came up last minute. His weekly visits became bi-weekly, then monthly. The phone calls that used to come every few days started spacing out, and when they did talk, Marcus sounded distracted, distant, like his mind was somewhere else. Eduardo told himself it was normal, that people moved on, that Marcus had his own life, his own problems, and couldn't be expected to hold Eduardo's hand forever. By the end of 2017, Marcus was calling maybe twice a month, and the conversations were brief, surface level. "How's Karen? How's work?" "I'm good, man, just busy, you know how it is." And Eduardo did know, or thought he did, because grief was exhausting for everyone, not just the person living it. Friends had limits, had their own lives to return to, and he couldn't blame Marcus for wanting to step back from the darkness that had swallowed Eduardo whole. Then in February 2018, Marcus called and said he was moving to Munich. His company was expanding into Europe, and they wanted him to head up the new office. It was a huge opportunity, he said, a chance to start fresh. Eduardo heard something in his voice that might have been relief, or maybe guilt, but grief made you paranoid, made you read meaning into everything. So Eduardo pushed the thought away and said, "That's great, man. Really happy for you." They met for drinks one last time at a bar in Midtown. Marcus looked thinner than Eduardo remembered, his eyes darting around like he couldn't quite meet Eduardo's gaze. He kept checking his phone, kept saying he had an early flight tomorrow, needed to finish packing. Eduardo felt the friendship slipping away, felt the last connection to his old life dissolving, but he smiled and shook Marcus's hand and said, "Keep in touch." And Marcus said, "Of course, brother. Always." And then he was gone. The calls from Munich came sporadically at first, then stopped altogether. Eduardo told himself it was the time difference, the demands of a new job, the natural way friendships fade when distance gets involved. He didn't know that Marcus had never gone to Munich, that the man he trusted most in the world had taken everything from him and disappeared into a lie so perfect, Eduardo never thought to question it. 6 years passed like water through a drain, slow, then fast, then gone. Eduardo woke up one morning in July 2023 and realized Karen was 9 years old, and he'd missed most of it. Missed the way she'd stopped asking about her mother. Stopped leaving drawings by the door. Stopped wearing red because she'd learned, without anyone telling her, that the color made her father's eyes go empty and distant. She was quiet now, careful, a child who'd learned to tiptoe around grief. Eduardo looked at her across the breakfast table and felt something crack inside him, because she deserved better. Deserved a father who wasn't just surviving, who could give her more than this half-life they'd been living. So he booked a trip to Freeport in the Bahamas. Told Helen they needed this. Told himself it was time to try again, time to show Karen that joy was still possible, that the world held more than the gray routine they'd fallen into. He packed their bags with sunscreen and swimsuits and a picture of Yvonne that Karen had asked to bring. On the flight down, Karen pressed her face against the window, watching clouds, and Eduardo thought maybe this was the beginning of something. Maybe they could learn to be happy again. The resort was called Paradise Cove, and for once the name wasn't a lie. White sand beaches stretched forever. Turquoise water so clear you could see fish darting between your feet. Palm trees swaying in warm breezes that smelled like salt and freedom. Their room had a balcony overlooking the ocean, and Karen ran straight to it, laughing for the first time in months. Eduardo stood behind her, listening to that sound and feeling something in his chest loosen, something that had been wound tight for 6 years. They spent the first day building sandcastles, elaborate structures with moats and towers. Karen was bossy about the architecture, telling Eduardo his walls weren't straight enough, his turrets were lopsided. He laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Well, excuse me, Your Majesty. I'm just an engineer. What do I know?" She giggled and splashed water at him, and for a moment they were just a father and daughter on vacation. Just a normal family doing normal things. The second day they snorkeled in water so blue it hurt to look at. Karen held his hand tight at first, afraid of the fish, but then she was pointing at everything: the striped angelfish, the brain coral, the sea turtle that glided past like an ancient ghost. Eduardo watched her face light up behind the mask and thought, "This is what I've been missing. This is what we both needed." On the third day they ate breakfast at the beachfront restaurant, fresh fruit and pancakes, while Karen told him about a book she was reading about marine biology. Eduardo realized she'd been talking to him all along. He just hadn't been listening. Hadn't been present. Hadn't been anything but a ghost himself. He promised silently that he would do better, would be the father she needed, would find a way to live again, not just for her but for himself. Because Yvonne wouldn't have wanted this. Wouldn't have wanted him to waste the life she'd lost. That evening they walked along the beach at sunset. Karen found shells and Eduardo carried them in his pockets, even though they were just broken pieces, nothing special. She asked him if he thought Mommy would have liked it here, and Eduardo said, "Yes, baby. She would have loved it." He meant it, and it didn't hurt quite as much to say it. He thought maybe healing wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was about learning to remember without drowning. And maybe, just maybe, they were finally learning how. Eduardo began to believe that the weight he'd carried for 6 years was finally starting to lift. That the darkness that had consumed him was beginning to recede. That he and Karen could have a future that wasn't defined by loss and tragedy. He went to sleep that night listening to the ocean, thinking, "Tomorrow we'll rent kayaks. Tomorrow we'll keep moving forward. Tomorrow we'll keep healing." He had no idea that tomorrow everything would shatter. That the life he thought he'd lost was about to reveal itself as the greatest lie ever told. The fourth day started like the others. Eduardo and Karen had lunch at the beachfront restaurant called Sunset Grill, open air, with ceiling fans turning lazy circles overhead and tables scattered across a wooden deck that overlooked the water. Karen was eating chicken fingers, dipping them methodically in ketchup while telling Eduardo about a hermit crab she'd seen that morning. Eduardo was listening, really listening, when he heard it. A laugh. Not just any laugh, but one he knew the way you know your own heartbeat, deep and familiar, the kind of laugh that used to fill his living room during football games, the kind that came from someone who was always confident, always at ease. Eduardo's head turned automatically, searching for the source. There, at the bar maybe 30 feet away, stood a man in a white linen shirt and sunglasses, broad shoulders leaning against the counter with that same posture, that same casual confidence. Eduardo's breath caught because it couldn't be. But it was. Marcus Cole, his best friend, his brother, the man who'd moved to Munich 5 years ago, was standing there in the Bahamas like he'd never left, like the ocean between them had never existed. Eduardo felt his heart start pounding, felt his hands go cold on the table. He told himself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Marcus was on vacation too. Maybe this was just an impossible coincidence. Maybe. Then she appeared. Eduardo saw her before his brain could process what he was seeing. He saw the red first, because of course it was red, a vibrant crimson dress that caught the sunlight, the color that used to be hers, that he couldn't look at anymore without feeling like something was tearing inside him. The woman wearing it walked up to Marcus at the bar, her hair longer than he remembered, falling past her shoulders in dark waves. She was laughing at something Marcus said. Eduardo's vision tunneled, his entire world narrowing to that single moment, to that single person. Yvonne. His wife. His dead wife. The woman he'd buried 6 years ago, the woman whose jewelry he'd identified in a morgue, whose funeral he'd stood through, whose ghost he'd carried every day for 6 years, was alive. Was standing 20 feet away. Was real. Was breathing. Was touching Marcus's arm with casual intimacy. Eduardo couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She leaned in and kissed Marcus. Not a friendly peck, but a real kiss, the kind that spoke of familiarity, of intimacy, of a relationship that had grown over time. Marcus's hand went to the small of her back, and Eduardo watched his entire reality crack and shatter like glass hitting concrete. "Daddy, are you okay?" Karen said, and her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, from another world. Eduardo couldn't answer, couldn't look away, because Yvonne was turning now, was scanning the restaurant with a smile on her face, That smile he'd dreamed about for 6 years, that smile he'd thought was gone forever. Her eyes passed over him without recognition, without pause, without any sign that she knew him at all. And that was somehow worse than everything else. Eduardo stood up so fast his chair scraped against the deck, loud and harsh. Karen jumped. "Daddy, what's wrong?" Eduardo grabbed her hand, maybe too tight, and said, "We have to go. Right now." His voice came out wrong, came out strangled and broken, because how do you tell your 9-year-old daughter that her mother is alive when you don't even understand it yourself? When your entire world has just revealed itself to be a lie? When the grief you've carried for 6 years has just transformed into something else entirely, into betrayal? He pulled Karen toward the exit, keeping his head down, his whole body shaking. Behind him, he heard Marcus laugh again, that same easy, confident laugh. Eduardo wanted to scream, wanted to run back and grab them both, wanted answers, wanted to understand how this was possible, how they could have done this. But all he could do was keep walking, keep moving, keep breathing, because if he stopped, he would shatter completely. They made it back to the room. Eduardo locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands, while Karen asked question after question. He had no answers, had nothing but the image of Yvonne, alive, Yvonne happy, Yvonne kissing the man he trusted most, burned into his brain like a brand that would never fade. Eduardo told Karen he wasn't feeling well, told her to watch cartoons in the room. Then he locked himself in the bathroom and pulled out his phone with shaking hands, found Marcus's number, the one he hadn't called in 3 years, the one that was supposed to connect him to Munich, to a friend who'd moved on with his life. He pressed call and waited through 4 rings before Marcus answered. "Hello." The voice was the same. Casual, relaxed. No hint of guilt, no recognition that anything was wrong. Eduardo said, "Hey man, it's me. It's Eduardo." There was the smallest pause, the tiniest hesitation before Marcus said, "Eduardo. Wow man, it's been forever. How are you?" Eduardo closed his eyes. "I'm good. Just calling to check in. Where are you right now?" Marcus didn't miss a beat. "I'm in Munich, actually. Just got back from a site visit. It's late here, almost midnight." Eduardo heard it, the lie, smooth as glass, perfectly delivered. He said, "That's great, man. I won't keep you. Just wanted to say hi." "Yeah, absolutely. We should catch up soon." Eduardo hung up and stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror and understood that everything, every conversation, every condolence, every tear Marcus had shed at the funeral, had been theater. Performance. The cruelest kind of deception. He called Helen, told her Karen wasn't feeling well, told her they might come home early but he needed a day to sort things out. Helen said, "Of course, baby. You take care of that girl." Eduardo said, "I will." And he meant it. Because whatever happened next, Karen couldn't see it, couldn't be part of it, couldn't know that her mother had chosen to leave her, had chosen to let her grow up thinking she was dead. For 3 days, Eduardo became a ghost. He left Karen with the Resort Kids Club, told them his daughter needed friends, needed normalcy. And then he followed them, Marcus and Yvonne, the couple who'd stolen 6 years of his life, who'd let him suffer, who'd let his daughter grow up without a mother while they played house in paradise. They had a routine. Morning runs along the beach at 7, holding hands, laughing, stopping to kiss while the sun rose behind them. Eduardo watched from behind a palm tree, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Breakfast at a cafe called Island Morning, where Yvonne ordered the same thing she used to order when she was his wife, fruit and yogurt and black coffee. Then back to their resort, the Ocean View, 2 properties down from Paradise Cove. Close enough that Eduardo could have run into them any day. Close enough that they didn't care, didn't think they needed to hide. Afternoons, Yvonne went to the spa while Marcus worked on his laptop at the pool bar. Eduardo wondered what Marcus did for money, wondered how they'd planned this, how they'd executed it, how many months or years they'd been planning to destroy him. Spa appointments at 3. Romantic dinners at 8. Always different restaurants. Always dressed up. Yvonne in red or white or gold. Always stunning. Always alive. Always everything he thought he'd lost. On the third night, Eduardo walked down to the port where fishing boats rocked against weathered docks, where the smell of diesel and salt hung heavy in the air. He found what he was looking for, found it easier than it should have been. A man in his 20s, maybe local, with desperate eyes and hands that shook slightly when Eduardo approached him and asked if he knew where someone could get protection. The man studied him for a long moment, then named a price that was triple what it should have been. Eduardo didn't negotiate. He just pulled out cash. The man led him to a storage unit behind a bait shop and sold him a 9mm handgun with no serial numbers, no questions, no paperwork. Just cold metal and a box of ammunition and instructions on how to load it, how to fire it, how to make it work. Eduardo put the gun in his backpack and walked back to his resort. He sat on the balcony while Karen slept inside, and he held the weapon in his hands, feeling the weight of it, feeling the finality of what he was about to do. He thought about justice. Thought about the funeral where he'd wept over an empty casket. Thought about the nights he'd stood in Karen's doorway, wondering how to tell her about death. Thought about 6 years of grief that had been manufactured, that had been a choice they'd made. He thought about Yvonne laughing at the bar. About Marcus's hand on her back. About the way they moved together like they'd been together for years, because they had been together for years. While Eduardo raised their daughter alone. While he learned to hate the color red. While he forgot what happiness felt like. And Eduardo understood that some betrayals were too deep to forgive, that some lies were too cruel to let stand, that justice wasn't something the law could give him. Because what law could punish this? What court could make them feel what he'd felt? What they'd stolen couldn't be returned. The only thing left was to make sure they understood, was to make them see him, was to hear them explain why they'd chosen cruelty over mercy, why they'd chosen themselves over everyone else. Tomorrow he would find them. Tomorrow he would get his answers. Tomorrow the lie would end. Eduardo left Karen at the kids' club at 3 p.m., telling the counselors he had some business to handle, that he'd be back by dinner. Then he walked the beach to the Ocean View Resort with the gun heavy in his backpack and his heart beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. He positioned himself near the spa entrance, in a corridor lined with potted palms where he could see without being seen. Yvonne emerged at 4:15 p.m., exactly when he knew she would. Her hair was damp from a shower, and she wore white linen pants and a coral blouse. Eduardo stepped out of the shadows, and she looked up. For the first time in 6 years, their eyes met, really met. He watched her face change, watched recognition hit, followed immediately by terror. She opened her mouth to scream, but Eduardo had the gun out, pressed against her ribs, hidden between their bodies. Don't make a sound. Don't run. Just walk to the elevator and take me to your room. Her face went white. Eduardo. Oh my God. Eduardo, please. Walk. And she did. Her whole body trembling as they crossed the lobby, as they stepped into the elevator, as they rode up to the 5th floor in silence so complete Eduardo could hear her breathing, rapid and shallow, like a trapped animal. Room 512. She unlocked it with shaking hands, and Eduardo pushed her inside and locked the door behind them. The room was beautiful, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, king bed with white linens, champagne chilling in an ice bucket like they were celebrating something. Eduardo wanted to laugh at the audacity of it, at the sheer fucking nerve of living like this while he'd suffered. Call him. Call Marcus right now. Yvonne was crying now, tears streaming down her face. Eduardo, please let me explain. It's not what you think. Eduardo raised the gun, pointed it at her face. Call him now, or I swear to God, Yvonne, I will end this right here. She called Marcus with trembling fingers. Baby, you need to come to the room right now. Something's happened. Please hurry. I'll be right there, Marcus said. Eduardo heard the concern in his voice, the love, and it made him sick. Made him want to pull the trigger right then. But he needed answers. Needed to understand. Needed them both here to face what they'd done. Marcus arrived 7 minutes later. He used his keycard and walked in saying, "Babe, what's wrong?" Then he saw Eduardo. Saw the gun. He froze in the doorway. "Come inside, Marcus. Close the door. Lock it." Marcus did, his hands up, his eyes wide. "Eduardo, man, whatever you think you know. I know everything. I saw you at the restaurant. I called you while you were here and you lied. I've been watching you for 3 days. So don't you dare stand there and tell me I don't know." The three of them stood in that room, Eduardo with the gun, Marcus and Yvonne backed against the window. "I want to know why," Eduardo said. "I want to know how you could do this. How you could let me think she was dead. How you could watch me bury an empty casket. How you could let Karen grow up without her mother." "Eduardo, we can explain," Marcus started. "I don't want excuses." Eduardo screamed, "I want the truth." Yvonne spoke first, her voice broken and small. "I was suffocating, Eduardo. I was drowning in that life. The house, the routine, the same conversations every night. I felt like I was disappearing, like I was becoming this thing that wasn't me anymore. And Marcus," she gestured to him. "Marcus understood me. Marcus saw me for who I really was. And I couldn't leave you the normal way, couldn't divorce you, because you're a good man and I knew you'd fight for us. And I couldn't do it anymore." Marcus stepped forward slightly. "I loved her, Eduardo. I've loved her since college, since before you two got married. And I tried to stay away, tried to be your friend, but we couldn't fight it anymore. And we didn't plan it to hurt you. We just wanted to be together, wanted a chance at happiness. And the accident, it was Yvonne's idea. She said it would be cleaner, easier than the truth." Eduardo stared at them, at these people he'd loved more than anyone, at their faces full of fear and guilt and justification. "So you bought a car and staged a crash and burned a body beyond recognition?" Yvonne shook her head. "No. No body. We just burned the car, planted my jewelry. The police didn't push hard. They assumed it was me, and we let them. And there it was. The full truth laid bare. They'd faked her death, let him grieve, let Karen grieve, let him raise their daughter alone while they built a new life in the Bahamas. While they laughed and ran on beaches and made love in 5-star hotels. While Eduardo's world had crumbled to ash. And they'd called it happiness. Called it love. Called it anything but what it really was. The cruelest, most selfish betrayal imaginable." Eduardo's hand tightened on the gun. "What about Karen? What about our daughter?" Yvonne flinched. "She's better off thinking I'm dead than knowing I chose to leave." And Eduardo understood in that moment that there was no explanation good enough, no words that could make this right, no apology that could undo 6 years of manufactured grief. Yvonne dropped to her knees then, her hands clasped together like she was praying. "Eduardo, please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was young and stupid and I made a terrible mistake, but please don't do this. Think about Karen. Think about what this will do to her." Eduardo laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Think about Karen? You want me to think about Karen when you abandoned her? When you let her grow up thinking her mother was dead? When you chose this," he gestured around the room, "chose luxury and lies over your own daughter?" Marcus stepped forward, his hands still raised. "Eduardo, man, we can fix this. We have money. I have money. We can disappear. You'll never see us again. You can tell Karen whatever you want. Tell her you were wrong. Tell her it wasn't me at the bar. We'll vanish. I swear to God, we'll go somewhere you'll never find us. Just please put the gun down." Eduardo saw it then. Saw the cowardice. Saw that Marcus thought this was negotiable, thought money could solve what they'd done, thought Eduardo would just walk away. And Eduardo thought about the funeral. Thought about 3-year-old Karen asking where Mommy was. Thought about the closed casket draped in white lilies. Thought about standing at a grave that held nothing but lies. Thought about 6 years of waking up alone. 6 years of Karen's drawings that said Mommy, Daddy, me, when there was no Mommy. 6 years of Helen driving down from Detroit because her son was drowning. 6 years of Marcus pretending to grieve, pretending to care, while he was living Eduardo's life with Eduardo's wife. He thought about the night he got the call. Thought about driving through rain to Savannah. Thought about identifying a melted wedding ring. Thought about the compass necklace, his true north, and understanding that his true north had been a lie. That everything he'd built his life on had been rotted at the foundation, had been designed to collapse, and he'd never seen it, never questioned it. Because you don't question the people you love. You don't suspect the people you trust. And that trust was what they'd used against him, was the weapon they'd wielded to destroy him. Yvonne was still begging, still saying, "Please, Eduardo, please. I know I hurt you, but killing us won't bring back those years, won't undo what we did. It'll just ruin your life too. It'll leave Karen with nothing." Eduardo said, "She already has nothing. She had nothing for 6 years because of you. And you know what the difference is now? She'll know the truth. She'll know her mother chose to abandon her. And she'll know her father loved her enough to make sure you couldn't do it again." The gun felt steady in his hand now. No more trembling. No more doubt. Just clarity, cold and absolute. Marcus saw it, saw the decision being made, and he lunged forward saying, "No, Eduardo, don't." Eduardo pulled the trigger once. Marcus fell, his white linen shirt blooming red. Yvonne screamed. Eduardo turned the gun on her. She said, "Wait, please, Eduardo. I love you. I always loved you." Eduardo said, "You don't know what love is," and pulled the trigger again. The silence after was deafening, broken only by Eduardo's breathing, harsh and ragged in the small space. He looked at them, at the bodies of the 2 people who'd taken everything from him, and felt nothing. Felt empty. Felt like maybe this was what justice looked like when the law couldn't touch you, when the crime was too cruel for courtrooms, when the only way to balance the scales was to make sure the debt was paid in full. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, he said, "My name is Eduardo Helms. I'm at the Ocean View Resort, room 512, and I just killed 2 people, Yvonne Helms and Marcus Cole. They faked her death 6 years ago, and I found them here and I shot them both. You need to send police and ambulances." The operator was asking questions, but Eduardo just set the phone down and sat on the edge of the bed and waited. The trial lasted 3 weeks. His lawyer argued temporary insanity, argued that discovering your dead wife alive with your best friend would break any man, argued that Eduardo had snapped under circumstances that no one should have to endure. But the prosecution showed the 3 days of surveillance, showed the illegal gun purchase, showed premeditation, showed that Eduardo had hunted them, had planned this, had chosen murder over calling the police. And the jury deliberated for 4 hours before coming back with guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 35 years to life. Eduardo stood there in his orange jumpsuit and felt nothing when they read the sentence. Felt nothing when they led him away. Felt nothing until he got to his cell and found a letter from Karen, forwarded by Helen. It said, "Daddy, I don't understand why you did it. Grandma says you were hurting, but you hurt me too. You left me just like Mommy did." Eduardo broke then. Finally broke. And understood that in seeking justice, he'd created another victim. That in trying to make them pay, he'd condemned his daughter to the same fate he'd suffered, growing up without a father, just like he'd grown up without one. In prison, Eduardo writes letters every week. Letters Helen reads to Karen. Letters that try to explain the unexplainable, that try to make a 9-year-old understand betrayal and grief and rage and justice. And he knows she won't understand, not for years, maybe not ever, but he writes them anyway because it's all he has left, all he can give her. Karen grows up in Detroit with Helen. Grows up quiet and careful. Grows up knowing her mother chose to leave and her father chose revenge, and she carries both truths like scars that never quite heal. Sometimes she visits Eduardo behind glass and plexiglass. Sometimes she doesn't. And Eduardo understands that this is his punishment, not the prison, not the years stretching ahead, but knowing that in destroying the people who hurt him, he destroyed the one person he was trying to protect. And that's a sentence that no court could ever hand down. That's justice of a different kind. The kind that lives in your chest forever. The kind that never lets you forget what you've done.